The honourable member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Mr. Speaker, on November 30th, 1874, one of the world's greatest statesmen was born, Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. He was an accomplished officer in the British Army, but caught the political bug, rising to become democracy's greatest defender in the 20th century. His leadership during World War II saved Britain and the world from Nazi tyranny and preserved the very foundations of the freedoms we enjoy today. Prime Minister twice, he was a prolific writer, and in 1953 was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his historical writings and speeches. While he faced many health issues, both physical and mental health challenges, he did so with grace and dignity. Many books have been written about him, including James B. Conroy's recent 2023, The Devils Will Get You No Rest, FDR, Churchill, and the Plan That Won the War. Churchill's quote, the pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, an optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty, has inspired me time and again, and so I say thank you, Sir Winston, and happy birthday.
L'honorable député de Montmagny, Lillet, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup.
Monsieur le Président, après 9 ans de ce gouvernement libéral, la vie est devenue insoutenable pour les Canadiens. Les loyers ont doublé, les paiements hypothécaires et les mises de fonds sont devenus hors de portée. Et les banques alimentaires enregistrent un nombre record de visites par mois. Qui encourage cette gestion économique complètement catastrophique? Le Bloc québécois qui, au lieu de défendre les Québécois, ne défend que les intérêts du premier ministre libéral. Le Bloc a voté pour 100% des dépenses libérales, notamment 500 milliards de crédits budgétaires pour gonfler la bureaucratie fédérale. Plutôt que de voter pour des mesures visant à réduire les dettes, les impôts, les taxes, le Bloc soutient toutes les dépenses incontrôlées de ce gouvernement libéral. Un gouvernement qui dépense plus que jamais et laisse les Canadiens souffrir des conséquences. Les conservateurs ont un plan pour réparer le budget. Nous allons coupler dans la bureaucratie et réinvestir dans les familles. Pourquoi? Parce que c'est les Canadiens qui méritent et les Québécois mieux que cette coalition Bloc libéral, parce que ça coûte trop cher et on leur donne trop peu. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for Brampton South.
Mr. Speaker, as we approach the holiday season, our government is making it easier for Canadians to celebrate by removing the GST, HST on a wide range of essential goods. Mr. Speaker, starting December 14th, Canadians can enjoy prepared food like vegetable trays, pre-made meals, sandwiches, without worrying about added tax. Whether it is dining in or ordering takeout restaurant meals are also exempt. Snacks from granola bars are also included because we know how important it is to have those treats during the holidays. And for those raising young families, children's clothing, car seats, diapers, and even toys like board games, books, print newspapers, as well as puzzles are also tax-free. Mr. Speaker, these are just a few of the many items that will make the holidays a little more affordable for Canadians. This is our government's way to ensuring that the holidays are a time to joy and celebration for all.
The honourable member for Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte.
Bravo.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, this Liberal government is not worth the crime or the chaos. Just this week, a Winnipeg police officer was stabbed in the neck during arrest at a shopping mall. While I am relieved to hear that this officer is recovering, incidents like these are happening far too often under this Liberal government. The 50% increase in violent crime since this Liberal government came to power is a direct result of this Prime Minister's soft-on-crime, catch-and-release policies. The Liberals made life easier for violent criminals by repealing mandatory minimum sentences for gun crimes with Bill C-5, made it easier to get bail with Bill C-75, and failed to stop the flow of illegal guns across the U.S. border. Canadians deserve a common-sense Conservative government that will ensure that repeat violent offenders remain behind bars while awaiting trial and will bring back mandatory jail time for serious violent crimes. A Conservative government will bring home safe streets.
Order, please. The honourable member from North Okanagan-Shuswap.
After 9 years of NDP Liberal policy failures, there is only one person keeping this Prime Minister in power, and that is the leader of the NDP. Remember the NDP leader's big stunt when he told Canadians he'd ripped up the coalition deal with the Liberals? It was a scam on voters of Elmwood-Transcona right before a by-election. Since that by-election, he's forgotten all those nasty words about the Liberals. He continues to support the carbon tax, sending Canadians to food banks in record numbers, a tax that even NDP BC Premier David Eby said he would scrap. The NDP Liberal soft on crime policies have led to a 50% increase in violent crime, and their hard drug legalization that fuels crime, chaos, death and destruction in our communities is a failed social experiment. Every day this Prime Minister remains in power is because of the leader of the NDP. It's time for Canadians to have their say in a carbon tax election now.
Order, please. The honourable member for Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, the holidays are a time for joy, for family and friends, and for giving back. For far too many Canadians, the rising cost of living adds a stress to this special season. We know that the government can't set prices at the checkout, but we can help put more money back in the Canadians' pocket. That's why, starting December 14, we are lifting the GST/HST on many essential goods over the holiday season. What does that mean, you ask, Mr. Speaker? That means no taxes on groceries, no taxes on restaurant meals, no taxes on children clothing and toys. Even the family Christmas tree will have GST/HST taken off this holiday season. I can tell you that much. Grandpa will be buying a lot of presents for Ariana. By making many essential goods GST and HST free, we will be delivering meaningful saving for Canadians with real relief at the cash register. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Nunavut.
Inuit are strong, Inuit are still here, Inuit will thrive. James Partridge, Felix Shapatakawak, Trey Angusadluk, Solomon Uyagasuk are a few Nunavummiut who have been either hospitalized or died while at the hands of the law enforcement. I thank their families for sharing some of their stories with me. I grieve with those who lost their loved ones. I share their demands for justice for their loved ones. We must keep their names alive until there is justice for them. Despite the efforts of colonial and genocidal policies, Inuit are strong, Inuit are still here, Inuit will thrive. Inuit sangiyumarit, Inuit tavavusuri, Inuit inusikatiangnyarivot.
L'honorable député de Repentigny.
Le Canada occupe cette année encore le 62e rang sur 67 en termes de performance environnementale. Bravo. 62 sur 67, c'est honteux. Pendant que le Canada confirme sur la scène internationale qu'il va d'échec en échec, du côté des conservateurs, on peut entendre le son des criquets. L'échec de la COP29 est-il symptomatique de l'échec du Canada en matière de lutte contre le changement climatique? Je dirais que oui. À Bakou comme ici, les discussions mènent à des compromis insuffisants et des promesses vagues. Il n'y a aucune mesure audacieuse pour limiter le réchauffement à 1,5 degré Celsius. Pourquoi? Pour avoir assisté à plusieurs COP depuis l'accord de Paris, je constate la présence de plus en plus assumée des producteurs de pétrole qui donnent l'impression que leurs intérêts prévalent sur ceux de la planète. Leur ingérence soulève des questions sur l'intégrité et l'efficacité de ces sommets mondiaux. Toutefois, je reste confiante, car ce n'est pas tout le monde qui se laisse berner par les pétrolières et gazières tout en étant obnubilé par les criquets. Bravo!
The honourable member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Deputy Prime Minister said she wanted to, quote, help Canadians get past the vibe session, unquote. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I do know that this Deputy Prime Minister has unleashed 9 years of economic vandalism on Canadians. Canadians are poorer now than they were 9 years ago. She might think that that's just bad vibes, but it's a fact from Statistics Canada. $500 billion have left Canada for the United States and taken thousands of jobs with them. Does she think those are just bad vibes? But does the Deputy Prime Minister think that if Canadians are lined up at the food bank or can't afford rent or mortgage, that it's their fault for having bad vibes? Taxes are up, costs are up, the deficit's up, and time is up. Canadians are desperate for change. They're ready for a common-sense Conservative government that will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime. And I'll leave the Deputy Prime Minister alone if she wants to talk about vibe sessions.
The honourable member for Mississauga Lakeshore.
Mr. Speaker, Conservatives pretend that they want to lower taxes, but when push comes to shove, they vote against it. Starting December 14th, many items will be tax-free, and Canadians will be able to keep more of their money in their pockets. But not if the Grinch in the Conservative bench has his way.
Right.
With Christmas around the corner, many people are looking forward to the spirit of giving, and we're hoping more families will have the opportunity to celebrate. So, to all members, don't be humbugs. Let's pass this tax cut. And folks, let's help everyone enjoy a very Merry Christmas.
Bravo. Oral questions. Questions orales. L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
Nous avons besoin d'un plan pour sécurité et l'économie qui met le Canada d'abord. Mais le premier ministre a su depuis des mois que M. Trump menaçait les tarifs et aujourd'hui, il n'y a pas de plan, sauf qu'un appel de Zoom, M. le Président. Pas de plan pour renverser la libéralisation de drogue qui a autant inquiété les Américains. Pas de plan pour renverser le chaos que le premier ministre a causé à nos frontières. Pas de plan pour annuler les hausses de taxes et impôts qui nuisent à notre économie pendant cette période d'incertitude. Où est le plan pour mettre le Canada d'abord?
Le très honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, j'ai eu un bon appel avec Donald Trump hier soir pour souligner à quel point ça fait des années, des décennies que nous travaillons ensemble pour créer de la prospérité des deux côtés de la frontière. C'est qu'en travaillant ensemble qu'on peut régler des défis auxquels on fait face ensemble et créer de la croissance, de la prospérité pour nous tous. On va toujours défendre les emplois, les travailleurs canadiens. On va le faire avec une approche Équipe Canada qui va au-delà de la partisanerie parce qu'on sait c'est ça qui fonctionne quand on se rassemble. C'est pour ça que j'ai parlé hier soir avec les premiers ministres Ford et Legault et pourquoi on va continuer de travailler ensemble pour défendre.
L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
Mais apparemment, l'appel n'a pas fonctionné parce que quelques minutes plus tard, le président Trump a menacé les tarifs sur le Canada. Même chose avec le bois d'œuvre et le Buy America. 3 présidents, 9 ans, ce premier ministre n'a rien obtenu. Et maintenant, il a admis avoir brisé l'immigration. On sait par exemple qu'il y a 700 étudiants étrangers au Canada qui doivent quitter le pays d'ici à peu près 1 an. Ils peuvent aller vers le sud illégalement, causant une menace économique massive. C'est quoi le plan pour réparer l'immigration qu'il a brisée?
Le très honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, il y a des étudiants internationaux qui viennent de partout dans le monde pour étudier au Canada, qui sont ici pendant leurs études et à la fin de leurs études, ils retournent chez eux. C'est ce qui se passe dans la grande majorité des cas et on a des mesures pour faire des suivis si les gens choisissent de ne pas rentrer chez eux. On a un système d'immigration qui répond aux défis auxquels on est en train de vivre. C'est pour ça qu'on a ralenti le débit et on réduit l'immigration vers le Canada pour permettre à notre économie de rattraper. Ça fait partie d'un système d'immigration qui fonctionne, qui répond aux besoins du moment.
L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
We need a plan for economy and security that puts Canada first. But despite the fact the Prime Minister has known for years that Trump was threatening these tariffs, and for 3 weeks that President Trump had won the election, the only plan he has is a Zoom call. No plan to reverse his disastrous liberalization of drugs that have killed people and now threaten our borders. No plan to fix the broken borders that he caused. No plan to cancel the tax increases that will drive billions and many jobs away. Where's the plan to put Canada first?
Le très honorable Premier ministre.
Speaker, instead of panicking and falling back on slogans like the Leader of the Opposition, we rolled up our sleeves and we're getting to work. We're working with all the premiers, pulling together in a Team Canada approach because that's how we defend Canadian jobs from coast to coast to coast. I spoke with Donald Trump yesterday evening, talked about how important it was for us to work together to solve some of the challenges we're facing as a continent, as countries, but also work to grow our economy, protect our workers on both sides of the border. This is the responsible, methodical approach we're taking as we move forward, while our opponent falls back on slogans and fear.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
He spoke with the incoming president, and moments later, Mr. Trump put out a tweet slapping a 25% tariff on Canada. So that worked about as well as the Prime Minister's efforts on Buy America and softwood lumber, which continue to be penalized, even though the previous Conservative government got both of those things lifted. Now move over to drugs. The Prime Minister's disastrous legalization and liberalization of drugs has the Americans worried, in addition to costing 47,000 deaths in Canada. Where's the plan to stop the drugs and keep our border open to trade?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the Leader of the Opposition is just making stuff up. I clearly spoke with the President of the United States an hour and a half after he put out his suggestion on tariffs. The reality is we're going to continue to work constructively with the incoming administration to protect Canadian jobs, to protect Canadian growth, to take the responsible approach that isn't steeped in partisanship, that pulls together the Team Canada approach that stands up for Canadians instead of throwing our arms up and saying all is broken like the Leader of the Opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, that's even worse. The statement went out promising tariffs before they even got a chance to speak. It's kind of like him backing down on Buy America and backing down on softwood lumber, Mr. Speaker. Now let's move to the tariffs the Prime Minister wants to impose on our economy. Quadrupling the carbon tax to 61 cents a litre would cripple our economy. New tax increases on work and energy would do likewise, sending hundreds of billions of dollars south of the border. Now that Canadians are facing this economic crisis, will he at least cancel his plan to hike taxes so we can save jobs?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, we see once again the Leader of the Opposition flailing and inventing stuff to try and fit his preferred attacks into his priorities. The reality is we're going to continue to work constructively with the incoming administration to do what Canada and the U.S. have always done, create prosperity together, protect jobs on both sides of the border as we grow the economy. When it comes to drugs, Mr. Speaker, we've taken serious steps on that and we'll continue to. But if the Leader of the Opposition is suggesting he wants to recriminalize marijuana, let him just say that.
That's right.
Order!
You're asking your caucus if that's right?
Order. L'honorable député de Belleuil-Chambly.
Monsieur le Président, les derniers jours et les dernières heures nous ont indiqué que nous allons traverser une période d'importante insécurité que nous allons vivre dans le Parlement pour des enjeux de commerce, de protectionnisme, de diatribes assez agressives dans le choix des mots. Et on suppose que c'est le moment pour rassurer des gens, pour rassembler des gens, pour donner un sentiment de sécurité, notamment économique. Et ça devrait s'appliquer d'abord aux gens les plus fragiles et les plus vulnérables de la société. Est-ce que le premier ministre veut considérer ajuster son projet de distribution de chèques de telle sorte que les retraités puissent avoir un sentiment de sécurité?
Bravo! Le très honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, nous reconnaissons à quel point les Canadiens en arrachent. C'est pour ça qu'on est en train de livrer un congé de taxes pour tout le monde pour les prochains mois, sur l'épicerie, sur les vêtements pour les enfants, sur bien des choses sur lesquelles les gens dépensent régulièrement. On est aussi en train de regarder comment on peut reconnaître que les travailleurs à travers ce pays ont porté un lourd fardeau au fil des dernières années en protégeant l'économie, en investissant pour leur avenir, en appuyant leurs êtres chers. On veut reconnaître le travail et les défis auxquels font face les Canadiens qui travaillent fort.
L'honorable député de Belleuil-Chambly.
Monsieur le Président, avant les travailleurs actuels, il y en a eu d'autres. Des gens qui ont travaillé toute leur vie, qui ont payé des taxes et des impôts toute leur vie, qui n'ont pas de recours alternatif. Le gouvernement donne des chèques à des gens qui n'en ont pas besoin et n'en donne pas à ceux qui en ont le plus besoin. Ne convient-il pas que s'il diminue le seuil des chèques qu'il donne et qu'il donne cet argent-là aux retraités qui en ont besoin, tout le monde ici risque d'être d'accord avec cette grande amélioration de son projet?
Bravo! Le très honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, tous les Canadiens en arrachent et de différentes façons. C'est pour ça que, par exemple, on est en train d'investir dans plus de places en garderie. On est en train d'investir avec une allocation canadienne aux enfants qui augmente à chaque année. On est aussi en train d'aider les aînés. On est en train d'aider les aînés avec des soins dentaires, avec une augmentation du supplément de revenu garanti en 2015 de 10 avec une augmentation de la pension de vieillesse pour les aînés plus âgés que 75 ans. On veut aussi être là pour d'autres catégories de Canadiens, comme ceux qui travaillent fort et qui en arrachent eux aussi. C'est pour ça qu'on va de l'avant avec cette initiative.
The honourable member from Burnaby South.
Donald Trump's threats of tariffs could threaten hundreds of thousands of Canadian mortgage-paying jobs. The only thing a bully responds to is strength. So where is our plan to fight back? Where is the war room? Where is a concrete plan to bring our issue before CUSMA? Why isn't the Prime Minister fighting like hell for Canadian jobs?
Hear, 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 hear. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, rather than panicking, we're engaging in constructive ways to protect Canadian jobs like we have before. I don't think the idea of going to war with the United States is what anyone wants. What we will do is stand up for Canadian jobs, as we have before, as we will continue to. Stand up for the prosperity we create when we work together. Stand up for the challenges that we're facing, that we're protecting Canadians from. There is work we can do together. That is the work we will do, seriously, methodically, but without freaking out the way the leader of the NDP seems to be.
L'honorable député de Burnaby Sud.
Canadians can't afford, if the government ignores this problem, they need to take it seriously. They can't afford another letdown. Les attaques de Trump n'étaient pas une surprise. On savait que ça s'en venait. Pourtant, le Premier ministre a préféré fermer les yeux et dire que tout allait bien. Des milliers d'emplois sont en jeu. Pourquoi est-ce qu'il est resté les bras croisés face à la menace de Donald Trump?
Bravo. Le très honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, de prendre au sérieux la défense de l'économie canadienne, c'est pas de partir en panique ou en peur, c'est de défendre les principes qui veulent que nous réussissons les mieux en Amérique du Nord quand nous travaillons ensemble. On va travailler avec l'administration américaine pour répondre les défis, les différends auxquels nous faisons face tous les deux en tant que pays et nous allons travailler ensemble pour créer de la prospérité pour nos travailleurs, pour défendre nos travailleurs comme on l'a déjà fait, comme on le fera dans l'avenir. Ce n'est pas le temps de paniquer, Monsieur le Président, c'est le temps de travailler fort et c'est exactement ce que nous faisons.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
We need a Canada First plan to fix what the Prime Minister has broken. The first time he went head-to-head with Trump, the Prime Minister was forced into accepting humiliating concessions on agriculture, steel tariffs, and on Buy American. And that was when Canada had a stronger position thanks to a decade of low-tax, pro-job, conservative policies. After 9 years of economic vandalism, though, he's put Canada in an extremely vulnerable position. Per capita GDP is now lower than 9 years ago. Canada has the most indebted unfunded household amongst our trading partners. We have the worst housing inflation, and food prices have risen 37% here, faster here than in the U.S. Now that he's negotiating a position of weakness, why should Canadians expect anything different?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Export Promotion and International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear. We will always be there to protect Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. We have been there for Canadians before when we renegotiated NAFTA. I remind the member opposite that it was the Conservatives who wanted us to capitulate during that time. But we stood strong, and that's a testament to the facts. Canada-U.S. trade is at an all-time high last year of $1.3 trillion. Canada places the highest priority on trade and the integrity of our shared border. Mr. Speaker, we look forward to working with the incoming administration.
Good job. The Honourable Member for Regina Capel.
It was that Prime Minister that was forced to accept humiliating concession after concession. And now he's kneecapped Canada's economy. He's slapped a massive carbon tax here while the U.S. doesn't have one at all. Yep. He's raising taxes on investing in Canada while the U.S. is fighting to attract investment there. Exactly. He's imposed a production cap on Canadian energy, meaning Canada will produce less of what the U.S. needs to buy. Yep. There are less than 60 days left to act. It's time for the Prime Minister to put aside his partisanship, his ideology, and his ego. Will he strengthen Canada's position by cancelling his carbon tax and all tax hikes on jobs and investments?
Yes. The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, will take no lessons from the Conservative. Their strategy, Mr. Speaker, last time was to capitulate. On this side of the House, as the Prime Minister said, Mr. Speaker, is to take that seriously and methodically. Mr. Speaker, we have been engaging with our U.S. partner on three key things. The first one is security. Security of the border, security of the North and the Arctic, resilient supply chain when it comes to semiconductors, when it comes to critical minerals, when it comes to energy, and put forward a growth plan for North America, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we'll fight for Canadians, we'll fight for industry, we'll fight for our country, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Everywhere we look, we find more evidence of economic carnage, and now we're up against the biggest economic and security superpower, and this government has no plan. We need a Canada First plan to fix what the Prime Minister broke. When he took office, our GDP per capita was 81% of the U.S.'s. Now it's fallen to 73%. It's a made-in-Canada problem, and it's not about vibes. It's driven by higher taxes, higher spending, higher regulation, and this government's economic vandalism. Faced with the threat of tariffs, when are they going to stop the vandalism and start fixing the crisis so Canadians have a chance?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, when the Conservative Party of Canada wanted us to back down during the last round of NAFTA negotiations, we stood up for Canada. We stood up for Canadian workers. Right. We stood up for the steel workers in Canada, Mr. Speaker. We stood up for Canadian auto workers. We stood up for our farmers and agricultural workers, Mr. Speaker. Right. They want to know what the plan is. We plan on doing it again and getting a win-win for Canada and the United States.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, they backed down themselves last time, and Canada has become poorer since then than Alabama. That's not a record that anybody should be proud of. Our productivity gap with the U.S. costs every Canadian $32,000 a year. Average return on investments are 35% higher in the U.S. than in Canada. Our government's plan to quadruple the carbon tax, they doubled housing prices, they increased taxes on work and investment. With the threat of crippling tariffs, will the Prime Minister and all of the tax increases so Canadians stand a chance?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we have an excellent relationship with the United States, a relationship that is mutually beneficial. We do enormous amounts of trade with the United States, and the United States depends on Canada for much of its energy supply, Mr. Speaker. They want to know what the plan is. The plan is to continue to work with the United States in order to protect Canadian jobs, in order to protect the Canadian economy and make it grow for everyone.
That's right. Hear, hear. L'honorable député de Mégantic-l'Érable.
Après 9 ans de ce premier ministre, on a besoin d'un plan pour mettre le Canada d'abord et mettre fin à son vandalisme économique. Il a brisé le système d'immigration, il est incapable de protéger la frontière, il a ruiné notre économie avec une énorme dette et en plus, nos jeunes ont perdu tout espoir de s'acheter une maison. Quel est le plan du premier ministre pour mettre le Canada d'abord et protéger l'avenir de tous les jeunes Canadiens?
L'honorable ministre de l'Innovation.
Monsieur le Président, on ne prendra aucune leçon des conservateurs. La dernière fois qu'ils nous avaient proposé une stratégie, c'était de capituler face aux Américains, Monsieur le Président. De ce côté-ci de la Chambre, on va faire les choses sérieusement et méthodiquement. Comme l'a indiqué le premier ministre, Monsieur le Président, ça fait des mois qu'on parle de nos homologues américains. On parle d'enjeux comme la sécurité de la frontière, la sécurité de l'Arctique, la sécurité du Nord. On parle de la résilience de nos chaînes d'approvisionnement dans les semi-conducteurs, dans les minéraux critiques, dans l'énergie. Et troisièmement, Monsieur le Président, on présente un plan de croissance pour l'Amérique du Nord. On sera toujours là pour défendre nos travailleurs, notre industrie et évidemment le Canada. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
L'honorable député de Mégantic-l'Érable.
Ce que l'on sait, Monsieur le Président, c'est qu'après 9 ans, ce premier ministre a échoué méticuleusement et régulièrement. Quel est son plan pour mettre le Canada d'abord? Parce qu'il a échoué à la frontière, il a échoué pour le bois d'œuvre, il a créé le chaos dans le système d'immigration, il a voulu effacer notre identité de nos passeports, il est responsable de la hausse du panier d'épicerie qui a augmenté 37 % plus rapidement qu'aux États-Unis. La vraie question, quel est le plan du premier ministre pour mettre les Canadiens en premier?
L'honorable ministre de l'Innovation.
Monsieur le Président, ce que les conservateurs voudraient évidemment pas parler, c'est le record d'investissement que le Canada a reçu en 2023, Monsieur le Président. L'an dernier, Monsieur le Président, le Canada a reçu près de 60 milliards d'investissements. Imaginez, Monsieur le Président, des investissements records, par exemple, dans le domaine de l'automobile, des investissements records dans le domaine des minéraux critiques, des investissements records dans le domaine de l'énergie, Monsieur le Président. Le Canada devient le partenaire stratégique de choix dans l'industrie décarbonisée. Le Canada sera un leader dans l'intelligence artificielle et le quantique. Le Canada sera un leader dans l'énergie nucléaire. Monsieur le Président, le Canada sera le pays du 21e siècle.
L'honorable député de Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte.
Monsieur le Président, Donald Trump veut imposer un tarif de 25 % sur tous les produits québécois et canadiens. Ce serait une catastrophe, y compris pour les Américains. D'abord, saluons que le premier ministre ait accepté de rencontrer ses homologues du Québec et des provinces dès demain. Mais il devra présenter une démarche claire. Il faut immédiatement protéger la gestion de l'offre avec C-282. Il faut qu'Ottawa démontre qu'il ne pliera pas concernant notre bois, notre aluminium, notre aérospatial et l'ensemble de l'économie québécoise. Devant ses homologues, est-ce que le premier ministre va se présenter avec un plan? Oui.
L'honorable ministre de l'Innovation.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie mon collègue pour son importante question. Comme l'a indiqué le premier ministre plus tôt, Monsieur le Président, il y aura une rencontre avec les premiers ministres, dont le premier ministre Legault. Et évidemment, Monsieur le Président, on se tiendra toujours debout pour nos travailleurs dans le domaine de l'aérospatial, pour nos travailleurs dans le domaine de l'aluminium, pour l'industrie, par exemple, des batteries qui est naissante au Québec, Monsieur le Président. C'est clair que maintenant, ce qu'on doit faire, c'est pas la panique, Monsieur le Président, mais c'est de travailler avec Équipe Canada, de mettre de l'avant les avantages comparatifs du Canada et de s'assurer qu'on défend l'ensemble de nos industries et l'ensemble de nos travailleurs.
L'honorable député de Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte.
Mais, Monsieur le Président, les tarifs de Trump, c'est pour forcer le Canada à resserrer ses frontières contre l'immigration illégale et le trafic de drogue. Ça fait des années que le Québec exige qu'Ottawa corrige sa passoire de frontières. Il a même déployé la SQ. Ça fait des années que le Bloc québécois talonne Ottawa au sujet des passeurs et du crime organisé. Avant même l'élection de Trump, on exigeait déjà plus de ressources aux frontières. Et malgré tous ces avertissements-là, Ottawa n'a rien fait. Puis là, notre économie se retrouve aujourd'hui menacée par les tarifs de Trump. Est-ce qu'ils comprennent maintenant qu'il faut agir aux frontières?
L'honorable ministre de la Sécurité publique.
Monsieur le Président, ce n'est pas seulement maintenant que nous avons compris l'importance d'appuyer nos forces de l'ordre, la GRC et les services frontaliers. C'est précisément qu'est-ce que nous avons fait depuis les 9 dernières années. Nous avons exactement les mêmes intérêts que les Américains afin de s'assurer que la frontière est sécure, l'intégrité de nos frontières, de permettre aux Canadiens de choisir qu'est-ce qui arrive au Canada. C'est la même chose pour les États-Unis. Il y a une histoire de collaboration quotidienne avec les Américains et c'est précisément qu'est-ce que nous allons continuer de faire.
L'honorable député de Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte.
Et là, il va falloir que le premier ministre annonce qu'il prend enfin ses responsabilités aux frontières. Il va falloir qu'il annonce comment il va boucher les trous de sa passoire frontalière d'ici janvier. C'est le strict minimum, après avoir abdiqué ses responsabilités, malgré les avertissements répétés des Québécois. Les passeurs et le crime organisé font la pluie et le beau temps aux frontières depuis des années. Et aujourd'hui, le fruit de l'inaction du premier ministre, c'est les tarifs de 25 % qui menacent l'économie du Québec. Est-ce que le premier ministre va enfin annoncer qu'il déploie des ressources suffisantes aux frontières?
L'honorable ministre de la Sécurité publique.
Monsieur le Président, encore une fois, nous avons toujours appuyé des ressources suffisantes pour appuyer le travail extraordinaire que font la GRC, les services frontaliers, avec leurs partenaires dans les corps policiers, que ce soit la Sûreté de Québec au Québec, que ce soit leurs partenaires américains. Et bonne nouvelle, Monsieur le Président, nous allons continuer de s'assurer qu'ils ont les technologies et le personnel nécessaire et nous allons appuyer davantage ces technologies et ces personnels-là pour s'assurer qu'ils puissent continuer à faire le travail qu'ils font déjà d'une façon exceptionnelle.
The honourable member for Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
We need a Canada First plan to fix what the Prime Minister broke on the addiction crisis and illegal drugs. 47,000 Canadians have died under this Prime Minister's watch. That's more than we lost in the Second World War. We need to fully reverse his liberalization of drugs that kills our people and threatens our borders. We need to secure our borders against the importation of chemical precursors that make fentanyl and other deadly drugs. Criminals are taking advantage of our drug policies and cooking fentanyl ready for export. Will the Prime Minister finally admit his policies have failed and end his insane drug policies?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, every life lost due to the illicit toxic drug supply in this country is a tragedy for families and for communities. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we've invested over $1 billion in treatment, prevention, harm reduction to save lives. We've worked with our U.S. counterparts on precursors, and we will continue to do the work to save lives based on evidence, based on health care, and based on protecting those who need help the most. We will not look away, Mr. Speaker. We are here to protect those who need our help.
Bravo. The honourable member for Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
That's not a plan. We need a Canada First plan to fix what the Prime Minister broke on the addiction crisis and illegal drugs. There's been a 200% annual increase in drug deaths under his watch. We need to fully reverse his liberalization of drugs, ban the drugs, prosecute every trafficker, secure our borders against drugs and chemical precursors that are making fentanyl and other deadly drugs. We need treatment and recovery so we can bring our loved ones home drug-free. Will the Prime Minister finally act in the interest of Canadians and fully reverse course on his radical liberalization of drugs?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we will lead with compassion, we will lead with health care, and we will lead with evidence. Mr. Speaker, since 2015, we have been investing in the treatments and the pathway that means the most to those whose lives we need to save. On that side of the House, Mr. Speaker, they cut the drug treatment fund by 2/3. When they cut the CBSA, they cut the drug checking laboratories. They don't protect Canadians, they don't address the illicit drug supply, and they don't understand that people need health care and help, and they need our compassion. Shame on them, Mr. Speaker. Good job.
The honourable member for Simcoe North.
The Prime Minister's economic report card is in. Canadians have the highest consumer debt in the G7. House prices have doubled. Per capita income is lower today than it was 10 years ago, and the average Canadian makes $30,000 less than their American counterpart, all as a result of this Prime Minister's economic vandalism. And in the face of economic uncertainty and global trade imbalances, this Prime Minister's plan is to increase taxes on job creators, entrepreneurs, and farmers. Will he enact a Canada First plan and stop these tax increases to keep our jobs and investment at home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
maybe that Conservative member missed the memo. We're actually taking federal taxes off, Mr. Speaker. We're taking the GST off of everyday goods in order to help Canadians. We are wondering on this side of the House how the Conservatives could be against a tax break for Canadians. This will put more money back in their pockets, Mr. Speaker, right around the holidays when they need it most. Mr. Speaker, this policy is good for Canadians, it's good for the economy, it's just bad for Conservatives.
The honourable member from Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, if the government doesn't want to listen to Conservatives, maybe they'll listen to economists at National Bank who found that real GDP has contracted 4% since 2022. This is unprecedented outside of a recession. It's a made in Canada, per person GDP recession caused by the economic vandalism of this Prime Minister's policies, whose only plan is to increase taxes on everybody, farmers, physicians, entrepreneurs, and all people who want to invest in Canada. When will the Prime Minister enact a Canada First plan to keep jobs and investment in Canada and our Canadians at home?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
What my honourable colleague doesn't quite understand is that we do have a Canada First policy. That's why we have the lowest net debt to GDP ratio in the G7. That is why we have a AAA credit rating. That is why we have inflation being decreased not once, not twice, but 3 times to 1.6% in September, Mr. Speaker. And at the same time, we have supports for Canadian, for example, the tax holiday and supports for 18 million workers come this spring, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we have the balance right, and we have a Canada First policy for Canadians.
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Once again, the Liberals have failed Canadians that need help most. People living with disabilities, students, and seniors have been abandoned by the Liberals' rebate program. My constituents are rightly furious. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that the students, the seniors, and the people living with disabilities in Edmonton Strathcona are not feeling the vibe right now. They are really, really struggling. And of course, the Conservatives would do nothing but cut these programs for Canadians. Will the minister fix this program and get help for those who need it the most?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the GST holiday will apply to everybody. All Canadians will benefit from this tax break, Mr. Speaker. But one of the things that I really take issue with is the insinuation that people with disabilities aren't working, Mr. Speaker. 62% of people in Canada with disabilities are working and will benefit from the check. There are 1 million seniors in Canada that are working and will benefit from this check, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are working hard and they deserve a break.
The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
That's not all Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Seniors and students in Courtenay Alberni are being left high and dry with the high cost of living. They're living on tight budgets and deserve a helping hand. Instead of helping, the Liberals decided to exclude seniors and students from their $250 rebate. They're letting people down again. Conservatives, they only want tax breaks for their rich CEO donors and big corporations who gouge Canadians at the grocery till. Will the Liberals fix their mistake and ensure seniors, persons with disabilities, and students get the rebate?
Yes.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I take issue with the insinuation that persons with disabilities don't work in this country. 62% of persons with disabilities will benefit from this rebate because they are working hard. Over 1 million seniors right across Canada are working and will benefit from this check, Mr. Speaker. And all Canadians, without exception, are going to benefit from the tax holiday that we just announced. We're there for Canadians and will always be there to have their back.
The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives spend their time amplifying anger and fanning the flames of division without offering specific solutions. In contrast, last week our government announced measures to support Canadians during the holiday season and into the new year. Could the President of the Treasury Board provide more details about our plan to help Canadians save money this holiday season and beyond?
I would invite the Honourable Minister. I'd invite the Honourable Minister to wait until she's addressed. The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, whether it is $10 a day childcare, increases to GIS and OAS, or the Canada Child Benefit, on this side of the House, we are always there to support Canadians. For example, with last week's announcement of a tax holiday on essential goods, clothing, diaper, food, Mr. Speaker, as well as cash back for 18 million workers, Mr. Speaker. While the Conservatives play partisan games, what we have to say is we have no idea whether their members actually would support this measure because they're not allowed to let us know.
And I encourage all members not to take the floor unless they are addressed by the chair. The honourable member from Chilliwack Hope.
After 9 years, we need a Canada First plan to fix what this Prime Minister has broken. Our standard of living has plummeted compared to the United States. The last thing Canada needs is a capital gains tax hike on our farmers, doctors, home builders and small businesses, but that's exactly what this Prime Minister is proposing. His tax hikes will drive investment, jobs, doctors and food production out of this country at a time when we can least afford it, with the threat of U.S. tariffs on the horizon. Why won't the Prime Minister stop making things worse and cancel his reckless tax increases on Canadian jobs and investment?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
It was this Liberal government that reduced taxes on the middle class not once, but twice, Mr. Speaker, and the Conservatives opposed that measure on both occasions. Now, Mr. Speaker, we're coming with a tax break for the holidays. That's going to mean more money in the pockets of Canadians, and yet again, the Conservatives are opposing this measure. Mr. Speaker, do the Conservatives really believe the talking points that they're saying? Mr. Speaker, if they did, they would vote in favour of a tax break for Canadians. That's what we've put on the table. How are they going to vote?
The honourable member for Chilliwack Hope.
Taxing farmers drives up food costs. Taxing doctors means it's harder to find one. Taxing home builders means fewer homes. Taxing small businesses means fewer paychecks. Raising capital taxes means less investment in the tools we need to halt the decline in our standard of living. Jobs and livelihoods are on the line. With the threat of U.S. tariffs coming down the tracks, will the Prime Minister give Canadian workers a fighting chance by cancelling his destructive tax increases on jobs and investment?
Common sense. The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I like very much the member, but let me inform him about a couple of things. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to jobs and investment, Canada received the largest investment in Onta's history, Mr. Speaker, $19 billion, the largest investment in 75 years. Canada also received the largest investment in Dow Chemicals history, 127 years, Mr. Speaker, an investment of $10 billion in Alberta. Mr. Speaker, we received the largest investment in 139 years of BHP in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, $22 billion. Canada is the envy of the world, Mr. Speaker. Let's talk up Canada and stop saying things like he said.
The honourable member for Oxford.
Mr. Speaker, we have learned from this government's own immigration documents that nearly 5 million people, 5 million people will have their temporary visas expire next year. The Minister of Immigration was asked for his plan in committee yesterday, but he had no plan. Can the Prime Minister correct his minister and tell us his plan to enforce and ensure that the nearly 5 million people that leave Canada when their visas expire next year?
The Honourable Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Refugees.
Let's examine the latest round of hysteria from the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about 4.9 million documents that apply, sometimes many to one person. These are tourists. These are people, the vast majority of whom leave the country, including artists that come to this country, including Bruce Springsteen and others. Meanwhile, when people's visas expire, Mr. Speaker, they are expected to leave If they are not, they will be removed at the same time the Leader of the Opposition is walking around with the member of Edmonton Millwoods promising not to deport people.
The honourable member for Oxford.
Mr. Speaker, again, there's no plan from this minister. And after 9 years of breaking our immigration system, his plan is to ask them to leave nicely. And now they're staring at 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods that will crush our Canadian workers and cripple our economy. We need a Canada First plan that fixes the immigration system and ensures that the 5 million people will leave when their visas expire next year. When will we see that plan?
Good job.
The Honourable Minister of Immigration, Citizenship and Refugees.
Mr. Speaker, again, we see now the Conservatives' rollover first program. They're talking about people that are here that do routinely leave the country. They come in as tourists. It includes a vast array of people. He's answering an OPQ question that they posed us. We were very precise in the answers they gave it. Sometimes it's not 5 million people, Mr. Speaker. It's a number of documents attached to the same person. So let's park the hysteria. Let's talk about real things. Let's talk about the managed plan to migration that is actually doing very well in this country, according to Canadians.
Hear, hear. Great answer.
L'honorable député de Rivière-du-Nord.
Bon timing aujourd'hui pour s'attaquer au crime organisé dans nos villes et à nos frontières, Monsieur le Président. Attaquons les bandits là où ça fait mal, le portefeuille. Le Bloc québécois a déposé ce matin le projet de loi C-420 pour établir un registre des organisations criminelles. Surtout, nous proposons d'inverser le fardeau de preuve sur les revenus de la criminalité. Nous proposons de permettre aux forces de l'ordre de geler ou saisir les biens des membres de gangs s'ils sont incapables de prouver qu'ils n'ont pas été acquis grâce au crime. Le gouvernement va-t-il nous appuyer? Qu'est-ce qu'ils en pensent?
L'honorable ministre de la Sécurité publique.
Monsieur le Président, nous sommes toujours ouverts à appuyer des bonnes idées quant à appuyer nos forces de l'ordre pour lutter contre le crime organisé. Il y a déjà des dispositions dans le Code criminel qui permet aux tribunaux, aux forces de l'ordre et ensuite aux tribunaux de saisir des biens ou des comptes de banque qui ont été des fruits de la criminalité. Cependant, si mon collègue propose d'autres suggestions, évidemment, nous serons tout à fait ouverts à regarder qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire pour toujours appuyer le travail important des forces policières.
L'honorable député de Rivière-du-Nord.
Facile, Monsieur le Président, inverser le fardeau de preuve. Je le réitère, aujourd'hui, le fédéral a tout intérêt à montrer qu'il prend le problème du crime organisé au sérieux. Les Américains nous écoutent. Notre projet de loi C-420 facilite le dépôt d'accusations contre les membres de gangs criminels et surtout, il donne des nouveaux outils aux policiers pour saisir les revenus de la criminalité avant qu'ils ne disparaissent. C-420 rend la participation au crime plus dangereuse et moins payante. C'est un message fort envoyé au crime organisé, tant dans nos rues qu'aux frontières. Est-ce que le gouvernement va nous appuyer?
L'honorable ministre de la Sécurité publique.
Encore une fois, Monsieur le Président, je remercie mon collègue pour l'idée que c'est important d'appuyer nos forces de l'ordre, d'appuyer nos procureurs et de s'assurer qu'il n'y a personne qui profite du crime et surtout du crime organisé. Nous reconnaissons le travail important que font la GRC avec des partenaires, que ce soit le Sûreté de Québec, Police provinciale de l'Ontario, des corps policiers municipaux. Il y a déjà des dispositions dans le Code criminel. Alors, le procureur général et moi, nous allons toujours regarder des bonnes idées pour améliorer et appuyer les forces policières à travers le pays.
The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
We need a Canada plan first to fix the Prime Minister's what he's broke in the Canadian Armed Forces. Under this Prime Minister, our warships are rusting out, our fighter jets are worn out, our Army has been hollowed out, and our military is so short of soldiers, sailors, and air crew that our troops are burnt out, and we're short 15,000 troops. Even his own defense minister has described the state of our military as being in a death spiral. Defense procurement has gotten so bad under these Liberals that they can't even supply the ammo and munitions that Canada and our friends need. Why has the Prime Minister turned Canada into an unreliable ally?
The Honourable Minister for National Defence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, all of us remember the last time the Conservatives talked about a Canada First defence policy, and we also remember what you did. What they did, Mr. Speaker, they gutted the defence budget. They reduced defence spending to less than 1% of our GDP for only the first time and only time in Canada's long history. And in the last 9 years, as we have doubled defence spending, those Conservatives have voted against every single dollar, just as they voted against support for Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, standing up for the Canadian Armed Forces may require the Conservatives to stand up to their leader. Yes.
The Honourable Member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Well, we know, Mr. Speaker, that this minister loves to fudge the numbers, and in reality, the former Conservative government bought 5 C-17 Globemasters, 17 new Hercs, 15 Chinook helicopters, 100 Leopard tanks, modernized the Auroras and Halifax-class frigates, and fought alongside our American allies against ISIS and the Taliban. Well, the Prime Minister reverses $2.7 billion cut to our armed forces and finally invested in our troops and put Canada's interests first.
The Honourable Minister for National Defence.
And we also remember when the conflict in Afghanistan ended, they gutted the defence budget, took $2.5 billion away from it, and reduced it for the only time in our history to less than 1%. Mr. Speaker, I have many conversations with members of the Canadian Armed Forces, and they have never told me what they need is another vacuous slogan. What they said is that they need real investment in ships, and in planes, and in infrastructure, and most importantly, in our people. And every time we have come before this House and asked for the money for those investments and for those people, they voted against it.
Order. À l'ordre, s'il vous plaît. L'honorable député de Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles.
Monsieur le Président, ce Premier ministre a démoli nos forces armées en prenant de mauvaises décisions, en gaspillant constamment les ressources en approvisionnement. Une chose qu'il pourrait faire aujourd'hui serait d'annoncer l'annulation des coupures d'1 milliard de dollars dans le budget du ministère de la Défense, puis de présenter un véritable plan pour réaffecter l'argent avec des priorités qui visent à la reconstruction des forces armées canadiennes et au renforcement de notre sécurité militaire en Amérique du Nord. Après 9 ans de gaspillage et de très mauvaises décisions pour notre défense nationale, est-ce que le Premier ministre a un plan pour un Canada d'abord?
L'honorable leader du gouvernement à la Chambre des communes.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Defence very clearly outlined our plan to support the Canadian Armed Forces and our plan for investment. But what we know, Mr. Speaker, is that when it comes time to stand up for our allies and to stand up for what we care about in the world, the Conservative members of Parliament stand down. When it came to supporting Ukraine last year with the Canadian Free Trade Agreement with Ukraine, what did they do? They voted against it, Mr. Speaker. They delayed it in the House of Commons. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we actually stand for the values that we care about, and we stand up for people that we care about. We don't just sit down and stand down because our leader told us so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Madawaska-Restigouche.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le temps des fêtes approche à grands pas et nous le savons, il s'agit souvent là d'une période de l'année très coûteuse pour les Canadiens. Même si les mesures de notre gouvernement ont maintenu notre économie dans une situation enviable par rapport aux pays du G7, ont réussi à rabaisser l'inflation et le taux d'intérêt, beaucoup de ménages connaissent encore des défis à joindre les deux bouts. Du moins, c'est ce que nous entendons dans nos circonscriptions. Le ministre pourrait-il nous informer des raisons pour lesquelles le chef conservateur devrait donner la parole aux membres de son caucus afin de laisser parler au nom de leurs électeurs et voter en faveur de notre plan visant à remettre plus d'argent dans les poches des Canadiens?
L'honorable ministre des Anciens combattants.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je tiens premièrement à remercier mon ami et mon collègue de Madawaska-Restigouche. Contrairement du chef du Parti conservateur du Canada, qui pense toujours aux coupures et l'austérité, de ce côté de la Chambre, Monsieur le Président, nous voulons appuyer les Canadiens et Canadiennes d'un bout à l'autre du pays. Et voilà pourquoi nous avons annoncé le congé de la taxe TPS. Monsieur le Président, nous voulons nous assurer que les Canadiens vont avoir la chance de vraiment faire qu'ils vont sauver des argents. Ce congé va les aider avec des couches, acheter des aliments préparés, des arbres de Noël, des jouets, des livres et même des visites au restaurant, Monsieur le Président. Nous serons toujours là pour appuyer les Canadiens d'un bout à l'autre du Canada. Merci.
The honourable member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
This desperate Liberal NDP government is bribing Canadians with a pricey gimmick. This temporary 2-month tax trick takes pennies off potato chips, yet adds more than $6 billion on top of this Prime Minister's inflationary deficit. Even the Prime Minister admits every extra dollar he puts into these handouts, it fuels inflation further. Instead of pennies off Pringles, call a carbon tax election now, so common sense Conservatives can axe the tax for good.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
This Liberal government reduced taxes on the middle class on 2 occasions, and the Conservative voted against it. Now we're giving a tax break, a tax holiday to all Canadians at a time when they need it most, Mr. Speaker, and the Conservatives are calling it a gimmick. Actually, the Conservative leader is trying to play the Grinch that stole Christmas, Mr. Speaker. We know that this is good policy. It's good for Canadians. It's good for the economy. It's good for our small businesses. It's just bad for the Conservatives.
The honourable member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
While scurvy makes a comeback, that member's bragging about taking taxes off of candy and booze, while 2 million Canadians are visiting a food bank in a single month, and 1 in 4 Canadians are skipping meals because of this Prime Minister's carbon tax scam that's making Canadians poorer. The Finance Minister says they're just having a vibe session, that she can fix it by taking pennies off of cheese puffs. If Liberals really want to feel the vibe of Canadians, call a carbon tax election so we can axe the tax for good instead of taking chump change off of chips.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Canadian mothers and fathers want to understand why the Conservatives want to take away their $10 a day childcare. Young Canadians who want to buy a first home want to understand why Conservatives want to take away investments that will build 750,000 new homes, Mr. Speaker. And all Canadians want to understand why the Conservatives oppose a tax break, a tax holiday for all Canadians, which will leave more money back in their pockets, Mr. Speaker. It's time the Conservatives come clean. They're against policies that help Canadians. They're against policies that will help our economy. They're just in it for themselves.
L'honorable député de Louis-Saint-Laurent.
Monsieur le Président, le dernier tour de passe-passe fiscal de ce gouvernement ne passe pas. De partout, les gens s'offusquent devant cette approche libérale. Tiens, voici le témoignage d'un citoyen de Montréal. Je le cite. « Ces 2 mesures ne sont pas structurantes. Il n'y a pas de vision à long terme. Ça risque d'avoir un impact minime pour certains nombres de personnes avec un coût extrêmement élevé de 6,3 milliards de dollars. Je me demande bien comment cette décision a été prise. » Savez-vous qui a dit ça, Monsieur le Président? Le député d'Honoré Mercier, l'ancien ministre des Transports et ancien lieutenant politique du Québec. Est-ce que l'actuel lieutenant politique du Québec est d'accord avec son prédécesseur qui, lui, a compris le gros bon sens?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire, la vice-première ministre et ministre des Finances.
Avec ces conservateurs-là, c'est toujours la partisanerie en premier puis les Canadiens en dernier, Monsieur le Président. Encore une fois, les conservateurs s'opposent à aider les Canadiens. On sait que le congé taxe va laisser plus d'argent dans le poche des Canadiens, Monsieur le Président, puis les conservateurs s'y opposent. Ils se sont opposés quand on a baissé les impôts pour la classe moyenne. Ils s'opposent encore une fois quand on veut enlever la taxe sur les produits de tous les jours. Ça n'a pas de bon sens.
The honourable member for Guelph.
Mr. Speaker, this week is National Addictions Awareness Week. It's a time for all of us to raise awareness as well as challenge stereotypes towards addiction. On this side of the House, we know addiction is a health condition and deserves to be treated like one in order to save lives. Can the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions share some of the ways our government is helping those in need?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, since 2017, our government has committed over $1 billion to support the work with provinces and territories to save lives and address those who struggle with addiction. We know that doing this work with community organizations, local healthcare providers, and communities, Mr. Speaker, whether they're municipalities or Indigenous communities, is the way that we make it through to save lives and meet people at their hardest moments. We know we need more harm reduction and prevention. We know we need treatment services and recovery and aftercare, Mr. Speaker. We are there for Canadians. We need to open the door to those who struggle with addiction so they're not alone.
The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, everyday Canadians are scraping by while CEOs get richer. Liberals are letting Canadians down. They put an expiry date on their GST cut. And on the rebate, the Liberals' message to seniors, students, and people with disabilities is, you don't get a break. It's shameful. And the Conservatives, they only want tax breaks for billionaires, not parents who are just trying to keep up with their bills and grocery costs. Why won't this government make billionaires pay their fair share so that seniors and people on disability get a break?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
I appreciate the question from my colleague opposite. She knows very well that our government has done the most in order to ensure tax fairness throughout the country, Mr. Speaker. We have acted in order to ensure that the very wealthy pay their fair share, and we are helping Canadians, vulnerable Canadians that need our support, as well as working Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Working Canadians are going to receive a check in the spring, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly hope that the NDP will support it.
The Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay.
Asia Pulp and Paper and the Wijaya family have a notorious track record. All of the alarm bells should have been sounding when their front company, Paper Excellence, showed up to get control of Canadian operations. Instead, this government laid out the red carpet. Now Asia Pulp and Paper controls vast sections of Canada's forests. Now, the Minister of Innovation brags that he's never taken any lessons. Well, obviously, he got played like a rube at the county fair. Why did this government abandon our workers, sell out our forests, and what are they going to do to protect our mills and our forestry communities? Good question.
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I have a lot of respect for the member, but I think he should get his facts straight, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we stood up for our workers and for industry. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we had a national security review. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, they are bound by undertakings for years to come, Mr. Speaker, to protect the industry, to protect our workers, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to national security, we will always be on the side of Canadians, always make sure that we protect our national interests and our economic interests, Mr. Speaker.
Chers collègues, j'aimerais tirer l'attention de tous les députés dans la présence, dans la galerie, dans les tribunes, d'une personne qui est un grand ami de ce Parlement et de notre pays. I wish to draw the attention of members to the presence of the gallery of a friend of this Parliament and certainly of our country, His Excellency Ruslan Stefanchuk, Chairman of the Verkhovna Rada, the Parliament of Ukraine. It being 3:16, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion to concur the 37th report of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Call in the members. I was going to say it's. The question is as follows. Mr. Genuis, seconded by Mr. Macaulay, moved that the 37th report of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts presented on Friday, March 22nd, 2024, be concurred in. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion will please now rise.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Leblanc.
Monsieur Leblanc.
Ms. Hutchings.
Ms. Hutchings.
Ms. Tassie.
Ms. Tassie.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Varani.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Scrow.
Ms. Scrow.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Vandal.
Mr. Vandal.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Madame Bibot.
Madame Bibot.
Ms. Jacek.
Ms. Jazik.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Arsenault.
Mr. Arsenault.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Ms. Zarowitz.
Ms. Zarowitz.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Monsieur Yacono.
Monsieur Yacono.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenbelt.
Ms. Vandenbelt.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Nur Mohammed.
Mr. Nur Mohammed.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Chatel.
Mr. Coteau.
Mr. Coteau.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Abu Taif.
Mr. Abu Taif.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Stewart, Miramichi Grand Lake.
Mr. Stewart, Miramichi Grand Lake.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Goodrich.
Mrs. Goodrich.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Canna.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Stanley.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Genereux.
Monsieur Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul's.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul's.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Madame Gill.
Madame Gill.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
À retour, Monsieur Barcelot-Duval.
Monsieur Barcelot-Duval.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Saint-Clair-Degagné.
Madame Saint-Clair-Degagné.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Johns.
Ms. McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Ms. Idlout.
Miss Idlout.
Ms. Gazan.
Miss Gazan.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Ms. Dance.
Miss Dance.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Mr. Bouleris.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. Zerillo.
Ms. Zerillo.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. May Saanich Gulf Islands.
Ms. May Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Que tous ceux qui s'opposent à la motion veuillent bien se lever. La Chambre attendra maintenant la fin de la période de vote électronique avant de poursuivre ses travaux.